Здравия всем зрителям и подписчикам канала Mad Story.
All right, welcome back to Cosmic Disclosure. I'm your host, David Wilcock. I'm here with Kori Gud, and in this episode, we're going to get into the Grand Experiment. This is something that is of particular interest to me, and I'm sure to many of you watching this program, because this experiment affects people who are human but may not fit in and may in fact have ET souls. So here for more information is Kori Gud. Kori, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So we've talked about the idea that there was a super Earth in our solar system that exploded 500,000 years ago, and that it deactivated some sort of protective grid around our own solar system and neighboring systems as well. And you said that shortly after this, a bunch of groups of ETs came in. And could you tell us a little bit about them, just to recap? Who are they and what do they want?
Yes, they've been referred to as this genetic farmer race. And they've been on some sort of a mandate throughout the galaxy to spread advanced life and to monitor and assist the development of that life, as well as the spiritual development of that life.
Could you define advanced life?
Advanced life would be, I guess, like a human being.
Okay. So, at what point did you become aware of this existing?
I first became aware of this program when I was around the age of 13. I was in these in what we're calling the MyLab programs.
Okay.
Once I had been put through the process of receiving the full dose of the serum that they were giving me for intuitive empaths, I was also about at the end of the training, and they wanted to have me out in the field. So around age 13, they took me to, which we've done an episode about, they took me to the Super Federation base outside of Jupiter. And I've described before how when we would fly into this temporal anomaly, that you ended up in a giant, like a bubble in space, that you couldn't see stars. It was just pitch black. And the space station was sitting right there in the middle, and you would see craft going to and from different races. And they were coming to have a meeting.
So why would ETs doing this be interested in a 13-year-old kid?
They had no interest in me whatsoever. I was there as one of 3 IE supports. They usually would have 3 intuitive empaths with them to help triangulate any type of deception, danger, anything like that.
Okay.
And as I've described before, they brought us into the main meeting hall, and we sat in sort of a horseshoe fashion in a delegate seat. And at that point, they were giving us smart glass pads to keep ourselves busy. And I was starting to read information in those about the group that I was there to support and the different genetic programs that they were involved in. And that's when I found out that there were 22 different programs.
Were you there to support an ET group? Is that what you're implying?
No, I was there to support the Earth delegation, but I was there to monitor everyone other than the Earth delegation.
So even though this Earth delegation is not elected, on some level they represent us for this council?
Right. It's they rotate in. The seat rotates to different people on Earth.
And what would be our role in these negotiations? What are we fighting for? What do we want? Why are we there?
We don't have a role. It's just an observation. We're just there to observe. And that was granted fairly recently from what I'm told.
Did they ever intend for this information to be known to the general public, or do they want it to stay strictly classified?
Classified.
The beings that you saw in this Super Federation, how extraterrestrial would they look to us?
Well, there were 60 plus different groups. So some of them looked very similar to us in size, not in size, but in configuration, humanoid. But, a lot of them were very human looking. They just had slightly different skin colors. I mean, they looked slightly different, but they looked fairly human. There were some that were obviously a part of this pre-Adamite group, the more ancient one. They were taller, and they had the elongated skulls. There was even the ones that I had talked about in the previous episode we did with green skin and black hair.
Do we know how local they are in terms of positions in our galaxy? Do they come from all over the galaxy, or is it more of a local area?
No, they come from all over the galaxy. Our local star cluster was once protected by a barrier, as we've discussed, by the ancient builder race.
Right.
And once that was brought down from the inside by some of the inhabitants, these groups finally had access to all this new, rich genetic stock. It was a very exciting time for them. They had not had access. The only genetic programming that had gone on inside this bubble, if you wish, were groups that had become advanced themselves genetically and were traveling around within that local star cluster doing genetic experiments. And that had been going on, for a billion years.
Just to review something that I believe you said before, are the people that evolve on planets in our local star cluster going to look more like us in general?
For the most part, they look very similar. Yes.
Okay.
There are, different types that aren't as mammalian looking.
It seems to me that we're pretty clear now that the secret space program was being run by the cabal, that there was some very negative aspects to it. The term genetic farmer to me sounds kind of derogatory. And I'm wondering if perhaps what they're doing might be actually more benevolent for human life on Earth than how the cabal-run secret space program might have been seeing it at that time.
When you are the petri dish or the rat in the cage, your perspective's a little bit different than if you're the one wearing the white coat.
But wouldn't you say that the basic idea of what they're up to, people hear the term genetic farmer, they might think that this is some kind of slave mill in which human genetics are being used for food or something like that, whereas what you've described before sounds more like an ascension plan that they're trying to help us.
It is a spiritual and genetic plan or program of evolution that is working in concert with the cosmic changes occurring in different regions. These cosmic, in different parts of the galaxy, these energetic influxes have occurred at different times and in slightly different ways. And they're working with the local populations in concert with those cosmic changes to enhance their DNA and to enhance their consciousness.
I was recently going through the Hindu sacred texts using a search engine, and I found approximately, and it's not exactly clear if they're all individual or not, but I found approximately 188 references to the solar flash. Everybody talks about this solar flash, and you have groups that are like reptilian groups called the Rakshasas. You have clearly groups like Krishna that have blue skin but are human-looking. There's a variety of groups that were on Earth at that time, and in these books, the Vedas, they talk about the solar flash as if everybody knows that this is going to happen. The sun's going to give off this big flash at the end of the age, and that there is some kind of transformation of life on Earth. So do you think that there is some relationship between the genetic farmers and what's going on in the Hindu ancient texts?
Yes, because this flash they're talking about is just a byproduct of these cosmic changes that are occurring, that were these energetic changes. So, yeah, it's a direct tie-in.
It's interesting because it's like reading other people's mail. Everybody takes it for granted. They all know this is going to happen. There's no question that it happens.
What happened before?
Yeah, so it's something they consider just to be a basic fact, like we would say that the color red is on a stop sign. Same thing. So if they are trying to promote our ascension, what is the difference for us when this solar flash would occur as opposed to if we were just out in the boondocks and nobody had ever done any of these experiments on us? What's the difference?
Well, I'd like to think that there's some sort of structure to the cosmos that I think that most likely you would still be advancing, but at a much, much slower rate. This is like putting like turbo speed on the ascension process.
It's almost like the analogy of the jack-in-the-box where we're spring-loaded and pow, something happens when the solar flash takes place.
Right.
What was the history of intelligent life on Earth, if any, prior to the catastrophe of 500,000 years ago where the super Earth blew up? Was there any human life or intelligent life on Earth before then?
Well, interestingly enough, this reptilian or saurian group that has been in conflict with humanity for so long claims that they originally were stewards of the earth and that they had their own experiment going on here. That some of these races that now have a mammalian experiment going on had sterilized their experiment, and that in doing so, they had lost 3 races. That
Three different intelligent species?
They call them, they said there are 3 lost races because of this cleansing that took place. So that's one of the claims made by the reptilians that, I have not had verified.
The insider Bruce, who gave me a lot of the information for Ascension Mysteries, said that the prevailing opinion within his insider clique now is that the asteroid or whatever it was that destroyed the dinosaurs was deliberately steered in, and that the moon was placed in its current position at that time to jumpstart more of a mammalian cycle for the Earth by giving us seasons that we wouldn't have had without it.
Yeah, interestingly enough, my recent contacts with some of these airmen that escort Sigmund, they told me that I had gotten the dates wrong. They said, according to their information, the super Earth blew up 500 million years ago, and that it was 60 or so million years ago that the moon came into orbit, and that a lot of stuff and that also they were telling me that it was really strange, but they were trying to push the dates out much further.
Well, my own research would suggest that they might have been disinforming you for some reason.
Yeah.
Because I've had multiple individuals say the same dates, and the 500,000-year-old date is precisely in the Law of One.
Right, and this is after Sigmund was missing, and they were asking me about his whereabouts, and so yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's been kind of weird since then.
Do we know anything about what these 3 reptilian races would have looked like, or where
Nothing.
did they go?
Possibly because the raptor group, it is postulated that they are remnants of the dinosaur race that escaped under Earth, underground, and they escaped the cataclysm. So I don't know if they could have been one race that survived and 3 more are missing, but it's interesting to think about.
So I know we covered the raptors before, but not everybody's going to have seen all episodes. So could you tell us a little bit more about them? This is a very strange thing, obviously.
And I found out since then that they have all different sizes and types.
Oh, really?
Right. And the ones that we see the most have feathered plumes on the back of their necks, like birds. They look like a mix between a dinosaur and a bird. They get real jerky, bird-like movements. The opening to where they are is somewhere in the jungles of South America, and they've been known to come out and hunt at night. This is information I've been given more recently, secondhand. It's not anything I read on the glass pads.
Do they make speech? Can they make speech sounds, or how do they communicate?
They communicate telepathically with each other.
Oh, so they don't actually speak.
Well, they make noises. They have all different types. Just like birds, they have non-verbal communications, different types. But yeah, they do not have a voice box. They do not have lips or a tongue, or the gene that everyone who has speech on the earth has. I doubt very seriously. But they are high intelligence and are pretty ferocious.
Are they technological in any sense, or are they just basically a primitive species?
They're pretty primitive technologically.
Are you aware of any technology that they have?
Just basic, not high technology, just, basic technology.
What would be a basic technology?
Well, like using sticks and rocks or putting things together. They're not super advanced.
Okay. So we have what appears to be a diabolical type of reptilian race that was growing out of the dinosaurs on Earth. Somebody else comes in and decides that needs to be sterilized and cleansed. Do the reptilian groups believe that they still are in control and that they have land and title rights to this planet as a result of thinking that they were here first?
Yes, that is one of their claims.
Okay. So it looks like what we're seeing, if this did in fact happen, is that these genetic farmer groups are actually terraforming, that they're able to remodel an entire planet based upon a certain desired outcome. Would you say that's true?
Yes, that's part of the grand experiment.
And if we've talked about the moon, we had William Tompkins say this as well, having just a massive amount of internal structure, is it possible that the moon could be transporting literally an entire biosphere from one planet to another inside of itself as part of this terraforming?
Well, that is one of the theories, that it's that ancient.
Okay. So if the genetic farmers are actively pursuing this type of a strategy, it seems like it's not just about creating life as we see it today. We are in the middle of something, we are not the end of something. Would you say that's true?
Right, yeah, we're pretty far along in the experiment.
Oh, we are?
I would say so. We're obviously about to reach some sort of a crescendo, so we'd better be a pretty good ways into the experiment.
Would you speculate that the experiment would conclude fairly soon after the solar flash, that whatever they get out of that is the outcome?
It won't conclude, it'll just change, go into a new phase.
Okay. So this could actually go on for, in our terms, quite some time.
It'll go on until everything returns to source or whatever happens at the end of time.
Would these genetic farmer groups acknowledge at some point that we would grow up enough to meet them and be aware of what had happened?
Definitely. The goal of these programs is to get each planetary sphere and the advanced beings on it to a point of self-management. At a certain point, we will be technologically, spiritually evolved enough to where we will start managing our own genetics and the pace of which we want them to evolve. That is the goal. They want to get everyone to that point. And at that point, you become a part of this grand confederation.
You've talked before about the galactic slave trade and the idea that whatever they've done here is so much more valuable than in many other places, that we are a highly desired, abducted commodity, either as slaves or as a source of genetic material. Why do you think this planet is so unique in terms of what they were able to accomplish with these programs?
Most likely because of its location in the local star cluster. It's right in the middle, right by a supergate. So beings are going to be able to come here easily from anywhere in our galaxy or other galaxies.
Do you have any specific information about the actual components of the genetic programs that these guys are running?
There is a genetic component, there is a spiritual component, and a related component, consciousness component. And the last component is one that we discussed, is the cosmic component. All of these working in concert with each other to work in timing with the cosmic component.
Okay, well that's interesting, because when we talked about this before, you had basically just described it as a genetic and spiritual component, and it's like a sliding scale between one or the other. So now you're also saying that there's a consciousness component and a cosmic component, as well as genetic and spiritual.
Right.
So could you delineate what these four categories would represent?
Right, and we just had never gone this in depth.
Okay.
The genetic program is pretty obvious. They're harvesting genetics from other star systems, galaxies, and once they've gotten to a certain point that they think will be a good catalyst for a different species, they'll bring it to that planetary sphere and begin to genetically manipulate that species. They have to stick to cosmic laws very strictly, the laws of free will. Mm-hmm. So one of the largest components of this program, and it took a long time to figure this out, was a lot of the people, if not most, that are being abducted and experimented on, they were incarnations of the soul group, I guess you would call them, of the beings that are doing the experiments. So basically, let's just say like an Eben. They don't normally do that much experimentation on humans, but if they wanted to go down and ethically do experiments on humans, they would have a number of their people leave their bodies, go down, go into incarnation on Earth, and then be a part of the experiment and allowing themselves in an agreement before they went in to be genetically experimented on.
Are you saying that cosmic law requires you to do that in order to play around with these experiments?
The cosmic law requires the benevolent ones to do this type of thing.
Wow.
It's they learn how to skirt these cosmic laws very well without crossing them.
Okay, so you have a genetic component, and you indicated that they are harvesting genetics from another planet. What does that mean? That sounds pretty terrifying.
Well, they're getting genetic samples from beings that they've developed to a certain period, and there's a being over here that needs that same development. So to give them a turbo boost, they'll take those genes, transport them over to this group.
It's not like they're throwing a being in a blender and then just taking the tissue.
No.
This is a very technical process, I
Well, I
assume?
mean, at this current day, if you were to give a genetic sample, you're just going to spit in a cup or get a swab. Right? They don't have to put you in a blender.
So that's what you mean by harvesting?
Right.
Okay. Then you also said there was a consciousness component to this. And could you explain what the consciousness component is and how that would differ from the spiritual component?
Yeah, the consciousness component is related to the spiritual component. The consciousness component is to have the target group, which would be us in this case, develop their consciousness on a schedule that matches the cosmic schedule that's about to occur. So it's all managed very carefully. And consciousness grows at a certain rate that they have calculated, but they're enhancing it by coming in and giving us different, not just religions, but cultural things. Teaching us how to raise animals and all the civilization kind of.
Yeah, this is interesting because it appears that if you look at this Atlantean catastrophe of 12,500 years ago, thereabouts, that in the aftermath we have independent civilizations all over the earth that seem to develop the technology of milling grain, metallurgy, plumbing, sewage, building technology, mathematics, time measurement, codified law. You're saying that these genetic farmers are centrally involved in all that type of stuff?
Yes.
And it's because they're keeping us on a timeline?
Well, not necessarily a timeline, but keeping us on schedule for the cosmic event. And they want to enhance us much further through this genetic engineering and spiritual engineering process so that when this event does occur, this cosmic event, that we are going to boost much further than we would if we developed naturally.
And it would appear that they are allowed to be gods, if you will, to show up in person with their craft and in their incarnate forms as they're going through these stages of a rebooting of civilization like this.
Yeah, if they're in the middle of a reboot, then but for the most part, no, they try not, the positive ones try not to appear in the sky or around human beings or other beings unless that is one of the catalysts that they're trying to use to have them grow in consciousness.
So if they want to teach us about alchemy or metallurgy or astrology or something like this and they don't want to appear, how would they be doing it?
Well, through leaders, they communicate with people telepathically. They give people ideas. They've done that with our scientists for a long time, seeded ideas and information to them subconsciously. So, that in the spiritual component is very much tied in with the consciousness component. That also has to do with these genetic farmers. They are incarnating as us to be a part of this experiment, but many of them are karmically tied because of the experiments that they've been doing. They can't go any further in their evolutionary process unless we come along with them. So that a lot of their agenda has to do with having us progress so they can.
Do they all have languages where, like, the name of their group would be something that would be able to be encapsulated in the type of consonant and vowel sounds that we use in our own spoken language?
I mean, some that we'd be able to pronounce.
Are there others that have anomalies in how they speak that would not be at all familiar to how we could talk?
Well, I mean, go to Swaziland or somewhere, just here on Earth, and you hear, the difference in how they communicate, clicking and pops and stuff. So, yeah, there's a wide range of ways that they communicate different types of languages. But there does seem to be one standard language that they share, that they use.
I was sitting down with Graham Hancock for dinner at Contact in the Desert, and we talked about some similar subjects as this, and he reminded me that he wrote an entire book called Supernatural, in which he discussed this idea that various indigenous cultures are making these cave paintings, and that may actually be a far more sophisticated language, sort of like a hieroglyphic that in some ways tethered to a psychedelic consciousness where the beings that they're drawing actually exist somewhere. So I'm curious if any of the languages that these genetic farmers have may involve a type of written hieroglyphic that does have a psychic domain that it activates by looking at it in some way.
Yes, yeah. There are a lot of the pictographic languages that the non-terrestrials have that in them will evoke that type of response. In us, it may evoke a similar response. It just depends on whether you're close to them. There are a lot of variables there.
So we talked about four components total, and the fourth one was a cosmic component. So where does that fit in with what we're discussing?
Well, the cosmic component is that in each region of our galaxy, the way that the galaxy, I guess, rotates, star systems and star clusters are moving into these high energetic gaseous areas that are a catalyst for this. And they calculate how quickly you're moving into it. A lot of these energies, they say, have been hitting us since at least the 1930s, but they've been increasing. So what they've been doing, the genetic farmer groups, is that they've been engineering humans genetically and also working on our consciousness and spirituality in a way to where when we get to the crescendo of this energy influx, that we will be ready to make a turbo jump in changing densities and changing consciousness, as opposed to if they hadn't have interfered, we would just be a slightly different version.
There's a lot of really interesting stuff in this genetic farmer subject for me, because the last time I ever used alcohol and drugs was on a Friday night, and I went to AA meetings starting on a Saturday, and that same weekend, I believe on Sunday, I wrote this long essay about Earth. It was called Earth as an Experiment, and I was describing the idea that there were ETs that were setting all of this up of our lives on Earth as part of a grand spiritual experiment. Do you think these genetic farmer groups show up as people?
Well, definitely. They incarnate as people, as human beings. So they will incarnate as a human being, and at the end of that lifetime, their people will come and retrieve that soul and add it back to their collective. They usually have a backup body for them. In fact, in the programs in the beginning, there was some confusion because some of these beings were coming in that we weren't real familiar with and abducting people and returning their basically dead bodies. And what finally occurred is that when we captured some of them and interrogated them, we found out that they were here retrieving some of their people who had died in crashes here thousands of years ago. And their people got caught up in the reincarnation cycle here on Earth. And what they had to do is locate their people, remove them, and remove the souls and put the souls into another container, and they would return the bodies. So they saw it as a rescue mission, and a lot of the people in the programs thought it was, there was something more nefarious going on.
Yeah, that wouldn't sound as much like one of the benevolent groups as a group that's probably more just tinkering around, but without so much of a spiritual focus.
Right, but this, from the perspective of this group, they're basically like Star Trek Voyager coming in to rescue some of their teammates that have been missing for 1,000 years or so. So they have a completely different perspective on it.
So how much memory do these, as they're called in the Law of One, the wanderers, how much memory do these wanderers have of who they really are once they become human?
They're basically a blank slate when they get here to keep them from violating the laws that they're trying to circumvent by incarnating here. So that's a part of circumventing those laws, is to incarnate here as a blank slate.
What would allow one of these people to escape the reincarnation cycle? You said once they come in, they have to reincarnate.
In our reincarnation cycle, for as much time as it takes them to, evolve out of it, which they can do a lot quicker since they've done it before. They're usually a species much more advanced than us, of course. But also what can happen is they can be rescued. If they're not rescued, they're stuck here until they complete the cycle.
From what you're describing, it sounds like some people might interpret this as if they're getting into a soul trap by coming here.
Well, their soul does get trapped, but what occurs is that each planetary sphere has its own reincarnation cycle. And if they get caught up in it and don't have anyone to rescue them, then they're going to have to stay in it until they are able to get out through, quick evolution.
In the Law of One, it says that any wanderer that engages in a consciously unloving act towards others gets caught up in this reincarnation cycle. That's actually stated in there. I'm wondering if anything that you've heard personally would validate that idea.
I mean, the validation of that idea is basically the report that when these craft have crashed in the past, they have gotten stuck in our reincarnation cycle. So that would correlate.
Right. So let me ask you this. Are all of these various ET groups, you said there was 40 or 60 of them at various Super Federation meetings, are they all basically cooperating with each other and working for the same goal?
They're working for the same overall goal, and they're loosely cooperating with each other. And they have treaties and agreements. But they are not, working in concert with each other. A lot of these programs are competing programs as well. That's why they have kept their experiments separate from each other, and they've instilled religious things like, do not mix with other races. They didn't want to pollute their experiment with another experiment.
Would they ever actually abduct someone outside of their own group for any reason?
Often these groups, they keep tabs on each other's experiments, and oftentimes they'll try to sabotage each other's experiments. What will happen is they will go and abduct a experiment or a person that is an experiment from one group and get the genetic information, do evaluations of their spiritual and consciousness level, and to keep tabs on how quickly their competitor's experiment is proceeding.
So you said that religion is one of the ways that these groups are partitioned. So are you basically saying that geographic regions with particular races and their own special spoken language, that those are all actually separate programs?
Well, yes, and the fact that these different races on Earth are found in different regions, separated by oceans usually, that is done on purpose to keep these experiments from intermingling and polluting one another. And that's where a lot of the social programming, religious programming has come in to, don't marry outside of your race, a lot of instilling of racism to make it us against them. They want us to self-manage on that level and not interbreed and mix with each other that will, pollute their experiments.
What would be the goal of them competing with each other like this? Is it about prestige? Is there some sense of winning if one group proceeds faster or develops faster spiritually or technologically?
I don't think it's that type of competition. They want to see their agenda completed first. And before all the treaties, a lot of these 22 different groups were battling with each other, when they first come into a area that has not been controlled by one of these genetic farmer groups, they have a whole routine of making claims, and there are skirmishes over claims. So they go through this whole process, which usually ends in some sort of a treaty, which they abide to until that experiment reaches the point of this cosmic portion of the program.
If you're saying that there are 22 different groups and there are also up to 60 attendees of races?
22 different programs,
okay.
60 attendees, and some of these attendees, there'll be like 5 groups working on one genetic program together.
Okay, that's what
and then some of them will be working on more than one program. They'll be working on other programs that are not in competition with theirs.
So you could actually have one particular culture on Earth in a geographically isolated region that might have as many as 5 different ET groups that would be working with them, incarnating among them, this kind of thing?
Yeah, and some of them might be just taking the genetic component. Others might be appearing to certain people on the ground and giving them religious ideology. Some of them might just be appearing to give them a boost in civilization, technology for civilization. So they work in concert with each other.
I'm curious about the population density of some of these groups on Earth, because it seems to me that someone might erroneously conclude that you would have only a few categories of these programs, given the fact that there's only a few major monotheistic religions. But what I'm hearing is, just like in medieval Europe, you have countries that are separated by mountain ranges or water, etc. You might have something that we would think of as a country that could be its own genetic program, not just that it's a race or it's one particular religion per se.
Regions.
Okay. So there could actually be a number of different geographically diverse regions that have their own experiments running in some sense.
Right, and sometimes multiple experiments if they coincide with each other.
So in the Law of One, people that have this type of heritage are called wanderers. They're also frequently called starseeds. And I would imagine that probably the majority of the people who watch our show would be ET souls, given what we know about them and how long I've been studying this ever since 1996. What would you say is a message that you could give to those people that might help them understand who they are, what they're doing here, and what their purpose might be?
Well, I guess the hardest thing for most of them to believe is that they agreed to come here and experience all this. Remembering that you, on some level, agreed to experience all this is the best way to keep yourself grounded, I think.
What would be a spiritual guideline for those people in terms of understanding what their purpose is for being here?
Well, most of those people are drawn to those things already, to eating properly, to raising their vibration through the type of information they watch and bring in, and meditating, that kind of a thing, and also mingling with people that are birds of a feather, I guess you would say.
It seems to me that a lot of people really get trapped into what esoterics would call victim consciousness, this idea that they are being oppressed by something that is gargantuan and totally beyond their control. And a lot of people seem to sign off on personal responsibility and move into that very comfortable skin of the victim role. What would you say in light of people that would be prone to thinking that way because they're awakened to the truth, learning that they volunteered to do this, that they volunteered to be here?
Well, we're learning that maybe we're not victims after all. This victim mentality, maybe that's just another psyop. Maybe once we realize what we are and our true potential, we will feel empowered and not like victims anymore.
I like that. All right, well, that's all the time we have for in this episode regarding the Grand Experiment. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's very fascinating to me with the history of being a wanderer and awakening to that in 1996. I'm David Wilcock here with Kori Gud. This is Cosmic Disclosure, and I thank you for watching.
Конечно же, хотелось бы услышать ваши комментарии по этому поводу.